They say there are deaths that don't need a coffin. No grave, no white candles or funeral flowers. Just a piece of paper, a seal, and the signature of the man you trusted completely. Lillian Mercer, one of the city's sharpest financial strategists, sits in the courtroom watching her husband stand before the judge and calmly explain why she no longer has the power to control her own life. And no one in that room believes things are about to change, until the courtroom doors burst open. If you're reading this story, please like and comment with the name of the city you're watching so I know how far my story has come. Now, let's begin. The morning of the hearing, Lillian Mercer woke up at 4:43 in the morning and couldn't remember where she was for 11 full seconds. That was the new normal. 11 seconds of nothing, blank. A white wall where her mind used to be. Then the shapes would return. The beige ceiling of the bedroom she'd slept in for 6 years. The faint smell of Grant's cologne still clinging to the pillow beside her, even though he'd moved to the guest room 3 months ago out of what he called concern for her rest, and the heavy, syrup-thick feeling behind her eyes that no amount of sleep ever seemed to fix. She sat up. Her hands were steadier than yesterday. That was something. On the nightstand sat a glass of water and 2 white capsules in a small paper cup. Her morning medication, which Grant had started preparing for her the way you'd prepare medicine for someone who couldn't be trusted to count their own pills. She stared at the capsules for a moment, swallowed them dry out of habit, hated herself a little for it. The bathroom mirror didn't lie, at least. She looked like a woman who'd been fighting something invisible for 8 months and losing. The hollows under her eyes had deepened. Her cheekbones were too prominent, her skin carrying that particular grayish pallor that comes from too many hours indoors. She was 41 years old, and she looked, on a bad morning, like she'd already been through a war. She'd built Mercer Investment Group from a regional asset management firm into a portfolio company managing close to $4 billion in capital. She'd done it in 11 years, starting the week after her father's funeral, working 18-hour days in a downtown Chicago high-rise, while other people her age were still figuring out their LinkedIn profiles. She was the kind of woman whose name made boardroom conversations go quiet. Now she needed her husband to remind her what day it was. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the mirror and breathed. In, out. She could do this. She'd survived the last 4 hearings, each one chipping something away from her, leaving her a little smaller, a little more corroded. She could survive today. What she didn't let herself think about, not directly, not yet, was that today wasn't another preliminary session. Today was the ruling. Grant Holloway was in the kitchen when she came downstairs, dressed in the charcoal suit he wore when he wanted to look trustworthy. He had a gift for that. Trustworthy. Concerned. The slightly furrowed brow expression of a man carrying a burden he never asked for. He'd cultivated it the way some men cultivate a particular smile. Consciously, carefully, over time. "You should eat something," he said without looking up from his phone. "I'm not hungry." "Lillian." He set the phone down and turned to look at her with those dark, attentive eyes. "Dr. Brennan said your blood sugar drops when you don't eat in the morning. It affects your—" "I know what it affects." He held up both hands in that practiced gesture. Patience, gentleness with a difficult person. "I'm just trying to help." She poured herself coffee. The first sip was the only good thing that had happened to her so far that morning. "Marcus will pick me up at 8:30. "I thought we'd ride together." She looked at him over the rim of her mug. "We won't." Something moved across his face. Not quite anger, something colder, more calculative. The flicker of a man adjusting his plan rather than losing his temper. Then the concern was back. "Okay," he said softly. "Whatever makes you comfortable." She didn't answer. She stood at the kitchen counter and drank her coffee and looked out the window at the gray November sky and thought about what it meant that she could no longer tell, with absolute certainty, which of her own memories were real. Marcus Chen had been her personal driver for 9 years. He was 53, quiet, meticulous, and he'd never once asked her a personal question she hadn't invited. When he opened the car door for her at 8:30 exactly, he took one look at her face and said, "There's a thermos of actual decent coffee in the cup holder, not whatever they were serving at the house." Lillian got in. "You're a decent human being, Marcus." "Low bar today, Miss Mercer." She almost smiled. Almost. The drive downtown took 35 minutes through morning traffic, and she spent most of it reviewing documents she'd already memorized, her own psychiatric evaluations, 3 of them, 2 commissioned by Grant's legal team and 1 by the court, all arriving at roughly the same conclusion expressed in different clinical language: significant cognitive impairment, memory disruption, emotional dysregulation, inability to manage complex financial decision-making. She read them the way you read an accusation against yourself. Furious and helpless at the same time. Because the symptoms were real, she knew that. She'd lived inside them for 8 months. The blackouts, the confusion, the moments where time would simply skip like a scratched record, and she'd find herself somewhere different with no bridge between the 2 moments. She'd tried to fight it, had demanded second opinions, third opinions, had insisted on neurological testing that came back inconclusive, had pushed back against every assessment until her pushing back became its own evidence of instability. She remembered the exact moment she'd understood what was happening, or thought she understood. It was 6 weeks ago, in a parking garage, when she'd found herself sitting in her own car with no memory of getting there, rain hammering the roof, her hands shaking in her lap, and the sudden crystalline certainty that this wasn't happening to her. This was being done to her. She had no proof. That was the problem. She had suspicion, and she had the maddening, unverifiable conviction of a woman whose own mind had been weaponized against her. Not exactly something you present to a federal judge. The Daly Center courthouse had a particular quality of light in November. Flat, institutional, the kind that made everyone look like they were waiting for bad news. Lillian walked through security with her attorney, Patricia Vance, who was 68 years old, originally from Baltimore, and had been fighting these kinds of cases for 30 years. "Tell me straight," Lillian said as they rode the elevator up. Patricia's expression didn't change. "Judge Carver has reviewed everything. The 3 evaluations, the testimony from Dr. Langford and Dr. Chen, the financial records Grant's team presented showing the decisions you made in the last year, those records were selectively pulled. I've explained that." "I know you have." Patricia paused. "Lillian, I need you to be prepared for the possibility that today doesn't go the way we want." The elevator opened. The corridor outside Courtroom 14B was already filling. Grant's legal team clustered near the doors, 6 of them, expensive suits, the kind of legal firepower you hire when you need to take something from someone. She recognized the lead attorney, a man named Clifford Baines, who had a reputation for guardianship cases the way certain surgeons have a reputation for amputations. Efficient, thorough, not especially interested in what got lost. Grant was already inside. He'd arrived early. Of course he had. She walked past his team without looking at any of them. The courtroom itself was smaller than she'd imagined, the first time she'd come here. Smaller and plainer, with none of the architectural weight you'd expect for proceedings that could permanently strip a person of their legal identity. Wood paneling, fluorescent lighting, rows of uncomfortable seats. The flags had that slightly faded look of things that have been standing too long in the same place. She sat beside Patricia at the respondents' table. Across the aisle, Grant sat with Clifford Baines and the rest of his team, and he had the audacity, she'd noted this at every single hearing, to look sad. Not triumphant, not calculating, sad. A man reluctantly doing what had to be done for someone he loved. She wondered how long he'd practiced that expression. The room filled slowly. Behind the bar, she was aware of faces she recognized. 2 of Grant's business associates, the financial journalist from the Tribune who'd written 2 pieces about her troubled state. A woman from the Mercer board she'd never quite trusted named Sandra Chu. They were here to witness, which meant they'd already decided what they were witnessing. Judge Eleanor Carver entered at 9:02 and the room rose. She was in her 60s, silver-haired, and had the demeanor of someone who had stopped being surprised by human behavior roughly 30 years ago. She settled herself, reviewed something on her desk, and began. The first 20 minutes were procedural. Patricia made a final motion to delay ruling pending an independent toxicology review that she'd been trying to obtain for 6 weeks. It was denied for the second time. Clifford Baines summarized his case in the smooth, efficient manner of someone reading a prepared text he'd already won with. The 3 psychiatric evaluations were formally entered into record. Dr. Langford testified briefly by video. a gray, distinguished-looking man who spoke about Lillian's condition with the detached authority of someone who had reached an unassailable conclusion. Lillian sat straight. She kept her hands still. She breathed. Grant testified. He was careful, measured, heartbroken. He described 8 months of watching his wife deteriorate, the night she'd driven to their lake house at 2 a.m. and didn't remember the drive, the board meeting where she'd reportedly become incoherent mid-presentation, the weeks where she'd refused to sleep, the weeks where she'd slept too much. He didn't exaggerate. He didn't need to. The documented incidents were damning enough, and he'd made sure they were documented. He paused at one point, pressing his fingers to his mouth briefly, composing himself. "I love my wife," he said. "This is the hardest thing I've ever done. She needs to be protected. From herself at this point." From herself. Lillian heard her own breathing, felt the particular quality of rage that has nowhere to go, compressed, dense, burning low in the chest like something that's been kept too long in a sealed container. Patricia cross-examined him. It was good. She'd prepared well, found 3 inconsistencies in the timeline, pushed him on the sequence of events that had led to the first psychiatric evaluation. He answered calmly. He had an answer for everything. Then Judge Carver asked if there was anything else before she proceeded to deliberation. Patricia stood, made one last argument for delay. Her voice was steady and precise and completely failed to move the room. The judge nodded, looked at her papers, removed her reading glasses and set them down, which Lillian had learned was the preparatory gesture for a ruling. This court has reviewed all submitted documentation, expert testimony, and the comprehensive evaluations conducted over the past 14 weeks. The main doors of the courtroom opened, not the way doors open when someone is being careful or polite, the way they open when someone has decided the room needs to know they've arrived. Both doors simultaneously, with enough force that the sound cut across the judge's voice. The bailiff moved. 2 of Grant's attorneys turned. People in the gallery twisted in their seats. 3 men walked in. The one in front wore a charcoal suit that cost more than most people's cars. He was perhaps 55, broad-shouldered without being heavy, with silver at his temples and the particular stillness of a man who had spent decades in rooms where one wrong word meant someone didn't leave. Behind him, 2 men in black, not obviously armed, but carrying themselves with the specific economy of movement that made the distinction irrelevant. The bailiff said, "Sir, this is a closed Damien Vescari." The man said it flatly. Not as an introduction, as an answer to a question no one had asked yet. "I have documentation pertinent to this proceeding. I'm told the court hasn't closed deliberation." The name hit the room like a stone dropped into still water. Lillian saw it happen. The ripple moving outward from the center, faces changing, postures shifting. Even Judge Carver, who had seen 30 years of Chicago's ugliest human behavior, went very still. Damien Vescari, the name that appeared in federal indictments that never quite managed to stick. The name that 3 different investigative journalists had spent careers trying to put on the front page of something that would hold up. The name that certain very serious men in very serious rooms invoked in the particular tone reserved for things they couldn't entirely control. He walked to the center of the courtroom and stopped. He didn't look at Grant. He didn't look at the judge. He looked at Lillian. "I'm here," he said, "to stop a murder disguised as due process." The room erupted. Both of Grant's attorneys were on their feet. The bailiff had his hand on something at his belt. Someone in the gallery made a sound like they'd been struck. Judge Carver brought her gavel down twice, hard, and the noise compressed into a tense, crackling silence. "Mr. Vescari." The judge's voice was controlled in the way that meant the control was costing her something. "This is a civil proceeding. Whatever you believe you have, I have 11 minutes of security footage," Damien said, showing the respondent's husband substituting her prescription medication with a compound that doesn't appear on any of the evaluating physician's documentation. "I have a laboratory report from an independent toxicologist in Zurich who has confirmed the presence of a sedative compound in samples we obtained from medication bottles removed from the Holloway residence 2 weeks ago. And I have the name of the neurologist who falsified 2 of the 3 evaluations this court has just accepted into evidence." The silence that followed was the kind that precedes either an explosion or a collapse. Lillian felt her hands go cold. She'd known. She'd suspected. She'd lain awake in the dark, constructing it in her head the way you build a case out of nothing, because you have nothing else. And she told herself she was paranoid. She'd let them make her tell herself that, but she'd known. Grant, across the aisle, had gone completely white. And for the first time in 8 months, Lillian Mercer felt something she'd almost forgotten the texture of. The first ragged edge of something that might become fury, and after that, might become the thing that saved her life. The gavel came down a third time, and the sound cracked through the courtroom like something breaking that wasn't wood. Judge Carver was on her feet. Lillian couldn't remember ever seeing a sitting judge stand during a proceeding. Not like this. Not with that particular quality of controlled alarm that suggested the woman was calculating 3 things simultaneously. The bailiff had moved to intercept Damien's 2 men in black and was having the quiet, tense experience of discovering they simply weren't going to be intercepted. They stood their ground without aggression, without a single word, with the specific immovability of men who had made a career out of being the last thing someone wanted to deal with. "Clear the gallery," Judge Carver said. Her clerk moved. The people behind the bar started collecting themselves. The journalist, Sandra Chu, Grant's associates, all of them filing out with the stunned, reluctant shuffle of an audience being ejected from a theater mid-scene. Sandra Chu looked back once as she reached the door, and Lillian caught her eyes and watched something complicated happen behind them. Not surprise, not quite guilt, something more specific than either. She filed that away. Patricia had her hand on Lillian's forearm, a steadying grip, firm enough to communicate something. "Stay seated. Don't move. Let this happen." Lillian hadn't planned to move. She was doing everything she could to breathe normally, which was harder than it should have been, because her heart was doing something irregular and unpleasant in her chest, and the sensation of 8 months of sedatives being metabolized out of a system that was finally beginning to clear was not a comfortable one. Across the aisle, Grant had rearranged his face. The phone was gone, back in his pocket, or passed to Baines under the table, she couldn't tell. The grief-stricken husband expression had been replaced by something more neutral, more controlled, the face of a man who had prepared contingencies. She'd spent 6 years believing that quality in him was executive composure. She understood now it was something different, the composure of a man who always had an exit. Clifford Baines was on his feet, hand raised toward the judge. "Your Honor, I have to object to this entire, whatever this is. This individual has no standing in this proceeding, and whatever documentation he claims to possess—" "Sit down, Mr. Baines." Judge Carver's voice had a new quality, not louder, sharper. "Mr. Viscari, you're going to explain to me in precise terms what you've brought into my courtroom, and then I'm going to decide whether to have you removed or whether this court needs to take a 2-hour recess. Choose your next words carefully." Damien Viscari had not moved from the center of the floor. He stood with his hands at his sides, perfectly still, the way a man stands when he's been in far worse rooms than this one and has learned that stillness itself is a kind of authority. He reached into his jacket, the bailiff tensed visibly, and produced a USB drive in a sealed manila envelope, which he set on the evidence table beside him. The drive contains 47 minutes of footage from security cameras installed in the Holloway residence, he said. The cameras were placed by a private security firm hired to monitor the residence after Ms. Mercer reported concerns about her personal safety to my organization approximately 9 months ago. Lillian heard Patricia make a small, involuntary sound beside her. She'd told them about Lillian. Damien's people had been watching the house for 9 months, and she had not known. She turned that over in her head and felt something uncertain move through her. Not quite fear, not quite relief. Something that hadn't found its name yet. The footage, beginning at timestamp 2 hours, 14 minutes, shows the individual identified as Grant Holloway entering Ms. Mercer's private bathroom on 17 separate occasions captured over a 6-week period, removing her prescription medication bottles and returning them minutes to hours later. The laboratory analysis in the envelope confirms that bottles recovered from the residence contain clonazepam and a proprietary sedative compound not listed on any of Miss Mercer's prescriptions. The dosage levels are consistent with producing the symptoms documented in all 3 psychiatric evaluations submitted to this court. The air in the room had changed. Lillian couldn't identify exactly how. The temperature was the same, the light was the same, but something had shifted in the molecular composition of the space. Some charge had altered. Baines said, "This is fabricated." The toxicologist is Dr. Anneliese Vogel of the University of Zurich. Damien didn't look at Baines when he said it. He was still watching the judge. She has 30 years of forensic pharmacology, has testified in 11 international criminal proceedings, and has no existing relationship with any party in this case. You're welcome to attempt to impeach her. Grant said quietly, "This is insane." It was the first time he'd spoken since Damien had entered the room. His voice was controlled. Almost. There was a thread of something underneath it. Not panic, not yet, but its precursor. The way a foundation develops a hairline fracture before the wall knows it's going to fall. Lillian turned to look at him directly for the first time all morning. He didn't look back at her. That was the tell. Grant Holloway, in 6 years of marriage, had always met her eyes, had made a habit of it, had turned it into a weapon. That direct, unwavering attention that made you feel seen and therefore trusted. He was looking at a point somewhere between Damien and the judge, and his jaw was doing something small and repetitive. She turned back to the front of the room. Judge Carver had taken the envelope. Her clerk had the USB drive. The judge turned the envelope over in her hands twice without opening it, the gesture of someone thinking rather than hesitating, and then she looked up. "I'm calling a 2-hour recess. Mr. Viscari, you will remain available to this court. Mr. Baines, I'll hear a response brief when we reconvene. Bailiff, please escort the parties to separate waiting areas." She stood. Everyone stood. She was gone through the side door before the echo of chairs had settled. The waiting room they put Lillian and Patricia in was a small, fluorescent-lit space with a water cooler and 4 chairs that had been chosen by someone who didn't want people to get too comfortable. Patricia closed the door and turned around and looked at Lillian with an expression she hadn't seen on the older woman's face before. "Did you know about this?" Patricia said. "No." "Lillian, no." She sat down. Her legs had started to feel unreliable, not from fear but from the specific physical exhaustion of a body that had been held too tight for too long, beginning, incrementally, to release. "I didn't know Viscari had footage. I didn't know anyone had footage. I went to his organization 9 months ago because I didn't know where else to go, and I needed someone who operated outside the systems that Grant had already contaminated. I asked for information. I didn't know what they were doing beyond that." Patricia sat across from her. "Why Viscari?" It wasn't a question. It was the sound of a lawyer absorbing a fact she didn't like. "Because he had reasons to pay attention to what happens inside Mercer Investment Group," Lillian said. "Because his organization has intersecting interests with several of our largest institutional clients, and he was aware of certain irregularities in the way some of those accounts had been managed since Grant started taking a more active role in operations. And because," she stopped, pressed her fingertips against her temple, "because I had run out of people I trusted who were accessible to me. Grant had been very careful about that, very thorough." Patricia was quiet for a moment. "How thorough?" Lillian looked at her hands. "My CFO, Raymond Holt. I thought Raymond was loyal to me. He's been with the company 8 years. I promoted him personally. 4 months ago, he submitted an evaluation of my capacity to manage the company to Grant's legal team, voluntarily. I didn't know until I saw it in the discovery documents last month. I saw that evaluation. Did you know he also altered 3/4 of reporting data before submitting it? That the numbers he showed to the 2 psychiatric evaluators as evidence of my deteriorating judgment were revised?" Patricia's expression shifted. "That's a serious allegation." "Yes." "Do you have proof?" Lillian was quiet. "That's what I thought." Patricia leaned forward, elbows on her knees. "Lillian, listen to me. Whatever Viscari has brought into that courtroom, if it's legitimate, if the footage holds up, if that toxicology report survives scrutiny, this case changes significantly. But you need to understand that whatever relationship you have with that man is going to become part of the record. The nature of your communication with him, the timing of when you approached him, all of it, Grant's team will use it." "I know." It opens questions about your judgment that I know. Her voice came out flat and hard, with more edge than she'd intended. She took a breath. I know it opens questions. I know how it looks. A woman who goes to a man like Damien Viscari for help doesn't look like someone whose judgment is intact. I knew that when I did it. I did it anyway because the alternative was sitting in that courtroom this morning and watching a judge hand my life to my husband, and I was not going to do that. Patricia studied her for a long moment. Something in the older woman's face resolved into a decision. All right, she said. Tell me everything. Everything you know, everything you did, everything you suspect. We have 2 hours. They didn't get 2 hours. 50 minutes into the recess, Patricia's phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. Her face did something subtle and immediately controlled. What? Lillian said. There are federal agents in the building. Patricia stood. 3 of them, according to the text I just received from a colleague on the 4th floor. FBI, Financial Crimes Division. Lillian felt the floor shift slightly beneath her. That was fast. Viscari's people were prepared for today. They had federal contact points ready before he walked through that door. Patricia was already moving, gathering her files. This wasn't improvised. Whatever this is, it's been planned for a long time. That landed somewhere uncomfortable. Lillian filed it away beside the thought she'd had about Sandra Chu's face in the gallery, the specific, layered quality of a thing she didn't yet know how to read. When the recess ended and the parties reconvened, the courtroom felt different, not in its physical dimensions, the same flat light, the same flags, the same institutional wood, but in the quality of attention filling it. 2 men in dark suits sat in the back row of the gallery that was otherwise still cleared of civilians. They had the specific, patient stillness of people who were watching and taking notes inside their heads rather than on paper. Clifford Baines opened with a motion to strike Damien's evidence on grounds of illegal surveillance, unauthorized entry, and chain of custody violations. It was a competent motion, delivered with the smooth authority of a man who'd made these arguments successfully before. Damien's attorney, who had materialized during the recess, a lean woman named Carter, who spoke as though she'd been awake for 36 hours and found that an acceptable condition, dismantled it in 11 minutes by presenting documentation of the security firm's licensing, a signed consent form from Lillian, dated 14 months prior, authorizing monitoring of the marital residence that Lillian had frankly forgotten she'd signed, and a certificate of evidence handling from a forensic laboratory in Delaware. Baines's second motion went faster. Judge Carver denied it in under a minute. Then the footage played. They set up a monitor at the front of the courtroom and the footage played, and the room watched Grant Holloway open his wife's medicine cabinet 17 times in 6 weeks, and each time the clip was clear and time-stamped and showed exactly what Damien had said it showed. He moved quickly, efficiently, with the particular deliberate quality of a man who had practiced. He used gloves on the later dates, which was either more incriminating or a sign of escalating awareness that what he was doing carried risks. The distinction didn't ultimately matter. Grant watched the footage with his hands flat on the table in front of him. His face was an achievement. She had to give him that. Even now, watching himself on a monitor, he maintained a controlled, faintly anguished expression, as though what he was watching pained him to see, as though the man on the screen was someone he didn't recognize. Lillian watched Grant instead of the footage. She'd already seen the footage. Carter had shown it to her and Patricia during the recess. She'd watched it once, felt a cold, total fury move through her like a change in weather, and then deliberately set the emotion aside because she couldn't afford it yet. Later she would sit with it. For now she watched her husband's jaw, watched the small muscle that flexed beneath his ear when he was working very hard to be still, and she watched the exact moment, 2/3 of the way through the final clip, when he stopped maintaining the anguished expression. For approximately 3 seconds, Grant Holloway's face went completely neutral. Not controlled, not suppressed, empty, in the way a room is empty when everyone who knows its secrets is gone. Then the grief came back, smoothed back into place. 3 seconds. She'd shared a bed with that face for 6 years. The toxicology report came next. Carter read the relevant sections into the record. Clonazepam at 3 times the prescribed dose. A secondary compound. The report used the phrase, consistent with a class of proprietary sedative agents that would, in the concentrations found, produce symptoms including memory disruption, dissociative episodes, emotional dysregulation, and significant impairment of executive function. Symptoms including memory disruption, dissociative episodes, emotional dysregulation. The exact language in all 3 psychiatric evaluations. Baines objected 4 times during the reading. Each objection was noted and denied. Then Damien Vescari took the stand. He answered every question Carter asked him with the brevity of a man who had decided exactly how much he was going to say and had no intention of elaborating. Yes, his organization had been contacted by Ms. Mercer. Yes, he had authorized a private investigation. Yes, the evidence had been gathered under appropriate legal parameters. When Baines cross-examined and asked, with barely concealed contempt, whether a man with Vescari's background and reputation had any business involving himself in civil legal proceedings, Damien looked at him for a moment with an expression of almost scientific interest. "I'm a businessman," he said. "What I saw was a business being stolen from its rightful owner through a method that I found distasteful. I acted accordingly. Is there a specific question you'd like to ask about the evidence?" Baines tried 3 more angles and found that each one ended in the same way, against a wall of precise, unornamented responses that gave him nothing to work with. Carter watched from her chair with the expression of someone who had deployed a very reliable tool. Lillian watched the jury of 2 federal observers in the back row. It was Dr. Nathan Langford who broke. He was the neurologist who'd authored the most damning of the 3 evaluations, the one that had been cited most extensively in Baines's written brief, the one whose credentials had been invoked 7 times across 3 hearings as the foundational expert opinion. He was reached by phone during a second recess, informed of the evidence that had been entered into record, and informed additionally, this part came from Carter, quietly, during a hallway exchange that Lillian was not supposed to hear and heard anyway, that the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit had already subpoenaed his billing records in connection with payments received from a shell corporation connected to 3 of Grant's business associates. He asked for 20 minutes to consult his own attorney. He got 15. Then he called back. Carter came into the waiting room where Lillian and Patricia sat and said, with no particular expression, "Langford is prepared to testify that his evaluation was prepared in collaboration with Grant Holloway's legal team, that he was provided with the symptom profile in advance and asked to construct an evaluation that supported a predetermined conclusion, and that he was paid $240,000 through a third-party financial instrument to do so." Patricia sat very still. "He's prepared to say this under oath. He's prepared to say it on the record this afternoon. His attorney negotiated partial immunity in the last 10 minutes. Lillian said, "Who else?" Carter looked at her. "I'm sorry?" "Langford is one of 3 evaluators. Who else did they get to?" Carter was quiet for a moment. "We have reason to believe Dr. Elena Chen, the second evaluator, received payment through a similar instrument. We haven't confirmed the third." The third evaluation was the court's own appointed examiner. "Yes." Lillian stared at her. "Grant paid a court-appointed examiner." "We haven't confirmed." "That's what you mean by haven't confirmed." Carter met her eyes. "Ms. Mercer, we're going to need you to be calm for the next several hours." "I am calm." She stood up, and the room shifted with a new quality of steadiness, a settling into something that hadn't been there before. The sedative fog was lifting in increments, had been lifting since this morning when she'd skipped the medication Grant had prepared, a decision she'd made by instinct rather than knowledge. The clarity that was returning felt unfamiliar, raw, like skin underneath a bandage, but hers, unquestionably hers. "I'm going to need you to tell me the rest of it." Carter exchanged a glance with Patricia. "Tell me," Lillian said. "The financial transfers we've traced," Carter said carefully, "don't terminate with the medical evaluators. There are additional recipients. 4 executives currently sitting on the Mercer Board of Directors have received payments from the same shell network. The amounts are consistent with compensation for cooperation in a structured plan to have you declared legally incompetent and transfer operational control of Mercer Investment Group to your husband. 4 board members. Lillian ran the names in her head, felt them click into place against 6 months of meetings where she'd sensed something misaligned, board votes that had gone subtly wrong, small decisions she couldn't quite explain. 4 board members. And Raymond Holt, and the 2 psychiatric evaluators, and whoever the court-appointed examiner turned out to be, and however many private investigators and attorneys and functionaries a plan like this required to execute. "How long?" she said. "The earliest transfers we've identified date to approximately 22 months ago." 22 months ago. She'd been married to Grant for 6 years. He'd started planning this before she'd had any reason to. The door to the waiting room opened. The bailiff. "The judge is reconvening." 1. Langford's testimony lasted 40 minutes, and the room temperature seemed to drop 6 degrees during it. He sat in the witness stand and dismantled the foundation of every evaluation that had been used against Lillian with the specific, methodical thoroughness of a man who understood that what he was doing was destroying his own career and had decided that was preferable to the alternative. He was precise. He named amounts, dates, account numbers. He named Clifford Baines as the intermediary through whom the engagement had been arranged. 3 seats to Lillian's right, she watched Baines absorb each statement with increasingly rigid stillness. Baines had been one of Chicago's most successful guardianship attorneys for 20 years. He had a reputation and a practice, and a particular way of moving through courtrooms that spoke of perfect, unassailable confidence. She watched that confidence calcify into something else as Langford spoke. Not panic, not quite, but its structural equivalent. A load-bearing wall understanding it had been built on the wrong foundation. When Langford finished, Baines asked for a 15-minute recess. Judge Carver looked at him for a long, unreadable moment. "Denied." Then she turned to Grant. "Mr. Holloway," she said, "given the testimony this court has received this afternoon, I'm prepared to hear directly from you regarding the allegations of medication tampering and the coordinated procurement of fraudulent psychiatric assessments. You remain under oath." Grant stood. He straightened his jacket. He looked at the judge with an expression that had finally, after 7 hours of the most extraordinary day of Lillian's life, begun to show the seams. "Your Honor," he said, "I'd like to consult with my attorney before Mr. "Baines," Judge Carver said, "advise your client." Baines leaned in. Something was whispered. Grant's jaw moved. He sat back down. Baines stood. "Your Honor, my client will be exercising his Fifth Amendment right and declining to respond to further questioning at this time." The courtroom was very quiet. Judge Carver wrote something, set her pen down. "This court is suspending all guardianship proceedings effective immediately pending federal investigation. The existing temporary order limiting Ms. Mercer's financial authority is hereby stayed. Mr. Holloway, you are instructed not to leave the state of Illinois." She paused, looked at Grant directly. "I've been on this bench for 19 years. In those 19 years, I have seen people try to take things from other people through every mechanism the law provides, and several it doesn't. What I have heard today in this courtroom is among the most systematic and deliberate abuses of the guardianship system I have encountered in my professional life." Another pause. "We're adjourned." Lillian sat in the sudden controlled chaos of the room, federal agents moving toward Grant's table, Baines already on his phone, Carter collecting her files with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had known this was coming, and she felt Patricia's hand on her arm again. "Breathe," Patricia said quietly. "I am breathing." "Breathe better," she almost laughed. Almost. And then she looked across the aisle and found that Grant was already being approached by 2 of the federal agents. Not arrested, not yet, just approached in that particular manner that precedes an arrest, and everyone in the room understood what it meant, and he was talking to them in a low, controlled voice. And then he looked up. He looked at her. For the first time all day, he looked directly at her. She'd expected anger, had braced for it. What she saw instead was something more specific and considerably colder. The look of a man recalculating, of a man who had lost a position on the board but not the game, of a man who was already, in the fraction of a second their eyes were connected, thinking about the next move. She'd seen it before, she realized. That look. She'd seen it across boardroom tables and dinner parties and the kind of quiet arguments that happen in expensive hotel rooms. She'd seen it and read it as ambition, as drive, as the quality she'd found so magnetic in him at the beginning. It wasn't ambition. It had never been ambition. She looked away first, looked at Damien Viscari, who was speaking quietly with Carter near the courtroom doors. As if sensing it, he turned his head and met her eyes. He gave a single, minimal nod. The nod of someone who has delivered a package and is confirming receipt, no more than that. Then he turned back to Carter. Patricia was gathering Lillian's coat and file folders. The bailiff was managing the room. The federal agents were still with Grant, the conversation beginning to have a new quality, and Baines had moved to stand between his client and the agents in the manner of a man who understood that his morning had just restructured itself into something considerably more serious than a civil guardianship hearing. Lillian stood, accepted her coat from Patricia, put it on. Her hands were steady, steadier than they'd been in 8 months. The fluorescent light in the courtroom felt different, sharper, more defined at the edges. She hadn't noticed until now how everything had had a slightly blurred quality for so long, how she'd attributed that to stress, to whatever was happening to her mind. She'd attributed so much to whatever was happening to her mind. Patricia touched her elbow. "Let's go. The agents will want a statement, but Carter says they can come to the office rather than—" The courtroom door opened again, not with the force Damien had used that morning, quietly. A single man. Not one of Viscari's, not a federal agent. He was perhaps 40, unremarkable in a gray coat, and he walked directly to Grant Holloway and leaned down and said something close to his ear in the approximately 4 seconds before the federal agent separated them, and Grant's face, Grant's extraordinary, controlled, performing face, did something Lillian had never seen it do. It went afraid, not recalculating, not composing a next move, afraid, cleanly and without architecture, the expression of a man who has just received information about a consequence he had not planned for. The man in the gray coat straightened, turned, and walked back out without looking at anyone else in the room. Grant looked down at his hands on the table. Then he looked at Lillian, and the fear was still there, but there was something underneath it now, something that, in a different context, might have looked like an apology, but was more precisely the look of a man standing at an edge he had not anticipated, staring at a drop he hadn't surveyed. "What was that?" Patricia said quietly. Lillian was already watching the door close behind the man in the gray coat. "I don't know," she said. But something in the quality of Grant's fear told her it wasn't about the federal agents. It wasn't about the footage or the toxicology report or Langford's testimony. It was about something else entirely, something that existed in whatever layer of this situation lived beneath the one she could see, in whatever architecture Damien Viscari hadn't yet decided to show her, in whatever the man in the gray coat had just communicated in 4 seconds that had done what 7 hours of courtroom destruction had not quite managed. The man in the gray coat was gone before Lillian reached the courthouse corridor. She pushed through the side door 30 seconds after he'd left, Patricia calling something behind her, and she made it to the hallway and looked both directions, and there was nothing. A janitor with a cart at the far end, 2 clerks talking near the elevator bank, the ambient institutional noise of a building that processed human disasters with the same indifferent efficiency as everything else. The gray coat had simply ceased to exist in the way that people cease to exist when they've been trained to. She stood there for a moment with her heart doing something irregular and her coat half on and the fluorescent light of the corridor making everything look slightly wrong around the edges. Patricia caught up with her. "Lillian, stop. Did you see which way he went? No, and it doesn't matter right now. The federal agents want us in a conference room on the 3rd floor in 20 minutes, and we need to— It matters." She turned to look at her attorney. Grant was afraid not of the FBI, not of the evidence. Whatever that man said to him in 4 seconds did something that 7 hours of this didn't. That's not nothing. Patricia studied her with the expression of a woman conducting a rapid internal assessment. "You're right that it's not nothing. You're also right that it's not your problem in the next 20 minutes. The FBI is your problem in the next 20 minutes. Can you hold the rest of it for 20 minutes? Lillian breathed in, out, put her other arm through her coat sleeve. "Yes." She wasn't sure that was true. But she was getting better at saying things she wasn't sure were true, which was an adaptation she hadn't needed before Grant had systematically dismantled every other tool she had. The conference room on the third floor had better lighting than the courtroom, which made it worse in a different way. Brighter, more exposed. Special Agent Dana Reyes was 40-something, compact, with the kind of watchful stillness that doesn't come from training alone, but from years of sitting in rooms where the thing you're looking for is what people choose not to say. Her partner, Agent Toll, was younger and took notes in a small black notebook with a mechanical precision that Lillian suspected was partly performance. Carter was already there. She'd beaten them to the room, which told Lillian something additional about the degree to which today had been choreographed. Ms. Mercer. Reyes didn't extend her hand. Gesture of neutrality, not hostility. I want to be direct with you about where we are. We've been investigating financial irregularities connected to Mercer Investment Group for approximately 5 months. What happened in that courtroom today accelerated a timeline we'd been building carefully. That's not a complaint. The evidence Mr. Vescari introduced is significant, but it means we're now moving faster than we'd planned, and I need your cooperation to fill in gaps. Lillian sat. Carter sat beside her. Patricia took the seat at the end. Ask, Lillian said. Raymond Holt. She'd been expecting Grant's name first. The sequence told her something. My CFO. Former CFO, as of this morning. He tendered his resignation approximately 90 minutes ago, which suggests he knew what was coming before the proceedings ended. We'd like your account of your professional relationship with Mr. Holt, specifically the last 18 months. Lillian took her through it. Methodical. Dates, decisions, the specific moments she could identify in retrospect as inflection points. The quarterly reports that had seemed slightly off in ways she couldn't isolate. The board presentations where data she knew to be accurate appeared in different configurations. The gradual sense that the information flowing to her about her own company had developed a filter she couldn't see through. She talked for 12 minutes without stopping, and Reyes listened without interrupting, which was its own kind of pressure. When she finished, Reyes said, Were you aware that Mr. Holt had a prior professional relationship with your husband before your marriage? The room temperature didn't change. The light didn't change. Something changed anyway. No, Lillian said. They worked together at Arrowwood Capital Partners from 2013 to 2016. Mr. Holt left Arrowwood approximately 8 months before you hired him at Mercer. Lillian heard that sentence arrive, felt it settle, ran the mathematics of it, the timeline, the sequence, the implications of a man she'd trusted with the financial infrastructure of her company having been chosen and placed and positioned not by accident and not by the executive recruitment firm she'd hired, but by the specific patient orchestration of someone who had been planning this long before she'd understood there was a plan. He wasn't recruited, she said. It came out very quiet. I recruited him. I found him through a search firm. The search firm that placed him had a consulting relationship with a holding company connected to your husband's personal investment portfolio. Patricia made a sound. Reyes looked at her briefly. How long? Lillian said. Reyes and Toll exchanged a glance. The kind that carries information between two people who've already discussed how much to release and when. Ms. Mercer, Reyes said, based on the financial trail we've developed, the earliest evidence of coordinated planning between your husband and individuals currently under investigation dates to approximately 3 years before your marriage. The conference room was very quiet. 3 years before the marriage, Lillian had met Grant at a charitable investment forum. He'd been charming and perceptive and had known, specifically and impressively, the details of 3 deals she'd completed that quarter. She'd found that attractive, had read it as research, as the sign of a serious person, had found it flattering that he'd done his homework. He'd been doing his homework for 3 years before he met her. She sat with that for a moment, felt it move through her the way a very cold thing moves when you swallow it, traveling down, spreading outward, arriving in places you didn't expect. The marriage itself, she said carefully, was part of the plan. Reyes didn't answer immediately. We believe the marriage provided legal standing that made the guardianship strategy viable. A business competitor couldn't pursue this approach. A spouse could. 6 years. She'd given him 6 years of her life inside a plan she hadn't known existed. Every argument, every tender moment, every evening she'd sat across from him at dinner and talked about the future. All of it inside the architecture of a scheme whose endpoint was stripping her of everything she'd built and locking her away inside a legal framework designed to make her disappear while she was still alive. She looked at her hands on the conference table. They were steady. She found that remarkable. Some part of her brain was apparently deciding that collapse was a luxury for later. "What do you need from me?" she said. They were in the conference room for 2 hours and 20 minutes. By the time Reyes and Toll were done, Lillian had provided 12 years of institutional memory about Mercer Investment Group's client relationships, operational decisions, and board dynamics that no amount of financial forensics could have assembled as efficiently. She was precise, and she was thorough, and she held the part of herself that was screaming in a locked room somewhere behind her sternum, and she did not let it out. Carter walked her out of the building at 6:47 in the evening into cold air and the particular darkness of a November Chicago evening that felt like the city had given up on light for the season. Marcus was at the curb. He'd been there since 9 in the morning, she realized. He'd waited. She got in the car and sat down, and the door closed, and she pressed the back of her head against the headrest and stared at the roof for approximately 30 seconds. Then she said, "Marcus, take me to the Mercer building." He looked at her in the rearview mirror, said nothing, pulled out. Whoopee. The Mercer Investment Group occupied floors 18 through 22 of a glass tower on Wacker Drive. At 7 in the evening, the floors were mostly empty. Security desk in the lobby, a few analysts burning late hours, the particular post-business day quiet of a place that runs on information and stops generating it at 5. The security guard at the desk looked at her with carefully controlled surprise. She had not been in this building in 4 months. Court orders and her own deteriorating state and Grant's careful management of her access had combined to keep her out of the place she'd built. She badged through. Her access still worked. Someone had either forgotten to revoke it or had decided not to, and she wasn't going to examine which. The 19th floor was her floor. Her office at the corner, the CFO suite, 2 doors down. Raymond Holt's suite, she corrected herself, though apparently he'd already begun his own process of erasure. The conference rooms and the central operations hub that she'd designed herself with the specific functionality of a person who understood that information is architecture. She went to her office first, unlocked it, stepped inside. It smelled faintly of disuse. Someone had cleaned it at some point. Recently, she thought, from the faint chemical undertone. The desk was clear. Her personal items, the photograph of her parents, the small stone sculpture she'd bought in Kyoto, the particular pen she'd used for significant contracts. These were still there, precisely placed, undisturbed. The office of a woman who'd stepped away temporarily and would be returning any day now. The office of a woman who had nothing to hide because she'd already been declared incapable of hiding anything. She sat in her chair. Her chair. The chair she'd spent 11 years making decisions from. She opened the left bottom drawer, reached to the back. Her hand found the small external hard drive she'd taped to the interior wall of the drawer 2 years ago, in a moment of the kind of paranoia she'd dismissed as excessive at the time. She hadn't told anyone about it. Not Grant, not Raymond, not the attorneys on either side, not Damien Viscari. She plugged it into her laptop. It contained, among other things, 11 months of mirrored financial data, raw server pulls she'd made before her access to the company's systems had been progressively restricted, before the fog had gotten bad enough that she couldn't trust herself to do it, before she'd lost the thread of what she'd been trying to document. She hadn't known what she was looking for when she'd started pulling the data. She'd just known she needed to preserve something before it was revised away from her. She started going through it. She found what she wasn't looking for 40 minutes later. The account structures were sophisticated. She had to give whoever had built them credit for that. They were layered through a series of vehicles that individually looked like standard institutional structures: a Cayman-registered fund of funds, 2 Delaware LLCs with innocuous names, a Singapore-domiciled trust. She'd seen similar architecture in legitimate complex investment strategies. The difference was the flow direction and the timing. Money was moving out of Mercer Investment Group's managed accounts, not in ways that triggered automated compliance flags. It was too precise for that, calibrated specifically to stay below thresholds. But it was moving, had been moving for 14 months, in consistent directional flows through the layered structures and ultimately to a beneficial owner she couldn't immediately identify from the documentation she had. She ran the numbers. Felt something cold and specific arrive in her chest. The total, across 14 months, was approximately $230 million. She sat back in her chair. This wasn't just about the company. It wasn't just about Grant seizing control of her assets through the guardianship proceedings. Someone had been extracting value from Mercer's client accounts while the guardianship case consumed everyone's attention. And the guardianship case, the poisoning, the evaluations, the years of systematic setup, had been designed in part to provide cover for the extraction. A CEO declared incompetent, a company in legal turmoil. Board members already bought, a CFO already placed. The infrastructure of legitimate institutional investment management turned into a vehicle for something that had nothing to do with the clients whose money it was. Her clients, people who had trusted her name on the door. She picked up her phone, dialed Carter. Carter answered on the second ring. Lillian could hear street noise, or Carter was outside somewhere. Ms. Mercer, is something... I'm at the Mercer building. I need you to get Agent Reyes on the phone right now and tell her the scope of what they're looking at is larger than what we discussed this afternoon. She pulled up the account structures on her screen. Tell her we're not talking about a guardianship fraud. We're talking about a $230 million extraction scheme that used the guardianship as operational cover. I have 14 months of source data. A pause. Then Carter said very carefully, "Where did you get this data?" "Tell Reyes first, then I'll explain." She hung up, turned back to the screen, started pulling the thread of the beneficial ownership structure, following the corporate trail with the specific, methodical focus of a woman who had spent 20 years understanding how money moves through systems designed to obscure its movement. She was 40 minutes into it when her office door opened. She didn't look up immediately. She assumed it was building security, or Carter, or someone from the night cleaning staff. She finished the notation she was making on a legal pad. Then she looked up. Raymond Holt was standing in the doorway. He was 51 years old, round-faced, and had for 8 years given the impression of a man whose entire personality was organized around being dependable. She'd promoted him because he was precise and because he didn't have ego complications, and because she'd believed, had genuinely, completely believed, that he was loyal to her rather than to the position she represented. He looked like he hadn't slept in 2 days. His tie was loosened, his jacket was gone, and he was holding his phone in his hand with the white-knuckled grip of a man who'd been waiting for a call that hadn't come. "I resigned this morning," he said, like that was the beginning of a sentence. "I know. I thought..." He stopped, started again. "They told me the proceedings would be completed today, that by this evening the transition of operational control would be, that there would be a new structure in place, and I'd be retained under the new management, and this would all be..." "Done," she said. "They told you it would be done." He came into the office, didn't sit, stood in front of the desk the way a man stands in front of a desk when he's not sure if he's a supplicant or an equal and has just realized the distinction matters enormously. "Lillian." His voice cracked on her name. First name. 8 years, and he'd always called her Ms. Mercer. "I need you to understand, don't." The word came out hard and flat, and she surprised herself with how much force was behind it. "Don't tell me you didn't have a choice. Don't tell me you were pressured or threatened. Don't make it into something I'm supposed to have sympathy for right now." He closed his mouth. "You altered financial reporting data. You submitted false documentation to court-appointed evaluators. You helped a man poison me and then provided the paperwork that made my poisoning look like mental illness." She held his eyes. "You've known me for 8 years. You've sat in this office and told me things about this company that you knew I would use to make decisions. For 4 of those years, you were feeding a parallel operation that was using this company to move money that didn't belong to the people moving it." His face crumpled slightly at that. "I didn't know about all of it. The extraction, I didn't know the full..." "You knew enough." Silence. "Where is Grant?" she said. Raymond blinked. I don't..." The federal agents, after the hearing, he wasn't arrested. He was questioned and released pending investigation. He was told not to leave the state. She leaned forward. So where is he? Raymond's mouth moved without producing words. That told her something. Raymond. She kept her voice level by a significant effort of will. The federal investigation is going to take everything apart. Everything you did, everything you knew, everything you were paid, every decision you made in this building for the last 4 years. You resigned this morning, which is its own kind of statement about what you understood was coming. The people who paid you to do this are currently in the process of determining what's salvageable and what needs to be discarded. You've been in this business long enough to know what happens to the operational layer when the people at the top start calculating what's expendable. He was very still. Tell me where Grant is going, she said. Not where he was told to be. Where he's going. Raymond looked at the floor, at his phone, at some middle distance that contained, apparently, the remainder of his professional and personal calculus. There's a property, he said, outside the city, about 80 miles north. He has it registered under one of the holding structures. It won't show up under his name. He stopped. He has a contingency there, resources. His team built it out 2 years ago. What kind of contingency? Documents, cash reserves, contacts. Raymond's voice had dropped to something barely above murmur. The kind of contingency you build when you know that a plan might need to abort. So Grant had always known this could fail. Had planned for this the way he'd planned for everything else. Ahead of schedule. Under a name no one would find without knowing where to look. And the man in the gray coat in the courtroom, the message delivered in 4 seconds that had put fear on Grant's face, hadn't been a threat from the federal investigators. It had been a signal from whoever was above Grant in this structure. A signal that the abort was being called and the contingency was being activated and that Grant needed to move. She picked up her phone again. Not Carter this time. The number she dialed rang twice. Damian Viscari answered. He said nothing, just the sound of his presence on the line, which was its own kind of response. There's a property 80 miles north of the city, she said. I need an address. A pause of approximately 3 seconds. You're at your office. How did you eat? You badged in 47 minutes ago. I still have active monitoring on the building. Not apologetic, not particularly explanatory. Simply a fact, offered in the manner of a man for whom surveillance was administrative rather than invasive. Stay where you are. My people will come to you. Grant is already moving. I know. Another pause, then in a tone that had no particular emotion in it, but carried a specific weight. Ms. Mercer, the man who entered the courtroom this afternoon, the gray coat, he wasn't a messenger from Grant's associates. She felt something shift. Then who? He was a messenger to Grant, from an organization that has been using your husband the same way your husband has been using you. Grant Holloway is not the top of this structure. He is the operational layer. The people above him have decided that operational layer is now a liability. Damian paused. They sent that message to tell him he has a window to disappear before they close it themselves. She sat with that for a moment. Grant, the man who had poisoned her, who had manufactured her destruction, who had spent years building the architecture of her removal, was himself a tool. A meticulously constructed, expensive, ultimately disposable tool. Who's above him? She said. That's the question I've been trying to answer for 11 months. A pause. And that's why Grant cannot be allowed to reach that property. Raymond Holt was still standing in front of her desk. He was watching her face with the expression of a man who has just understood that the room he walked into is much larger and more dangerous than the doorway suggested. Lillian stood up, pulled the hard drive from the laptop, and put it in her coat pocket. Picked up the legal pad. Raymond, she said, you're going to call Agent Reyes right now, and you're going to tell her everything. Not a negotiated subset. Everything. She held his eyes. Because in about 4 hours, what you know is going to be the most valuable thing you possess. And after 4 hours, the people who paid you to do what you did are going to start making decisions about what to do with people who know as much as you know. Do you understand the difference between those two windows? He understood. She could see him understand it. the knowledge moving through his face in a long, slow wave. She walked past him to the door. "Lillian." He said it to her back. She stopped. "I'm sorry." She didn't turn around. "Save it for the deposition." She walked out into the corridor, called Carter as she moved toward the elevator. "Get Reyes. Tell her Grant Holloway is not the primary. Tell her there's a structure above him we don't have visibility on yet, and that he's been activated to run. And tell her we have 14 months of extraction data that may tell us who's been directing this." The elevator opened. She stepped in. Her reflection in the mirrored elevator doors was not the reflection she'd been seeing for 8 months. The gray, eroded, chemically dimmed version of herself that she'd been slowly accepting as the truth of what she was becoming. This was something else. Someone leaner and harder around the eyes. Someone who had had something taken from them and was now in the precise, dangerous space between the taking and the reckoning. The elevator descended. Her phone buzzed. A text from a number she didn't recognize, but the message had the specific spare quality of Damien's communication style. "Vineyard Property, Kellerman Road, 81 miles northwest. He left the city 18 minutes ago. We are 20 minutes behind. So are the federal agents. The people above him are closer." She read it twice, felt the absolute crystalline certainty of what was happening settle into her bones. Grant wasn't running to his contingency to disappear. He was running to his contingency because the people who controlled him were sending someone to close the file, and the only thing Grant Holloway had left to trade with was the information he carried in his head. The names, the structures, the full architecture of a scheme that was worth $230 million and possibly more. And if the people above him reached him before anyone else did, that information— The elevator hit the lobby and Lillian was moving before the doors finished opening. Marcus was still at the curb. She didn't know why she was surprised. He'd waited 9 hours, what was another 20 minutes. And she pulled the door open herself before he could get out and said, "Kellerman Road, 81 miles northwest. Drive like we're late." He looked at her once in the mirror. Put the car in gear. She called Carter. "Where's Reyes?" "On her way to the Mercer building. I'm not at the building anymore. Tell her Grant is running to a property on Kellerman Road, 81 miles northwest of the city. Tell her there are parties converging on that location who are not federal agents and who have reasons to ensure Grant Holloway doesn't produce a statement for anyone." A pause. "Tell her to move fast." She hung up, dialed Damien. He answered immediately. "You're in a car." 20 minutes behind you. "What do you have on the property?" 12 acres. A main house, 2 outbuildings, underground storage. It was built out as a functional safe house. Power generation, communication array, vehicle access from 3 approach roads. A brief pause. The sound of movement underneath it. "Grant isn't alone. He has 2 men with him, former private security, and the people above him. We've identified 2 vehicles that left the city in the 30 minutes after the courtroom. Different routes. They're converging." "How many?" "Enough to be a problem." He said it without particular inflection. A man stating weather conditions. "Miss Mercer, this is not the courthouse. Whatever happens at that property tonight, I know what it is. You should stay with your attorney and let my people and the federal— Grant has information in his head that ends this tonight or disappears tonight. You know that. I'm the only person with enough standing to make him produce it before either your people or the federal agents or whoever sent the gray coat gets to him first." She watched the city lights blur past the window. "He spent 6 years trying to destroy me. He'll talk to me in a way he won't talk to anyone else. He still thinks he understands how I think." Silence. Then, "The main road turns to gravel past the Kellerman Road sign. Don't use headlights after the turnoff." He disconnected. Marcus hadn't said a word. He was doing 90 in the left lane, threading through the thinning traffic with the controlled efficiency of someone who'd been doing this long enough that speed was just a variable he managed. The city fell behind them. The expressway opened up and the darkness outside became a different quality of dark. Farmland, tree lines, the occasional cluster of lights at a distance. Lillian turned the hard drive over in her coat pocket. $230 million. 14 months of data. The financial architecture of a scheme whose top layer she still couldn't see. Built by people who had used her husband the way Grant had used everyone around him. As a mechanism, a precision instrument, something you deploy and then retire. She thought about the 6 years. Tried not to and did it anyway, the way you probe a damaged tooth. Not because it helps, but because the alternative is pretending it isn't there. She stopped after approximately 90 seconds, put it back in the locked room behind her sternum, and left it there. There was one thing left tonight, and she was going to finish it. The gravel turnoff was invisible from the main road. No sign, no reflectors, a gap in the tree line that you'd miss at speed. Marcus found it anyway, slowed, killed the headlights, and took the turn. The drive through the darkness was approximately a mile, gravel pinging against the undercarriage, tree canopy overhead blocking what little there was of a moon. Lillian could see, maybe a quarter-mile ahead, the low amber glow of exterior lighting that hadn't been turned off, which meant Grant had arrived already and either didn't care about visibility or hadn't had time to think about it, and neither of those options was reassuring. Marcus stopped the car where the tree line ended and the open ground of the property began. "This is as far as I go," he said. First words in 90 minutes. "I know." She opened her door. The night air was cold, wet, carrying the smell of late November earth and the distant animal scent of rain that was coming but hadn't arrived yet. "Ms. Mercer?" She looked back. Marcus was looking at her in the darkness with an expression she couldn't fully read. "You've been my employer for 9 years. In those 9 years, I've seen you do things in boardrooms that most people couldn't do. Tonight is different. I know it's different. I want you to know that I'm aware of that." She held his eyes for a moment. "Stay with the car. If things go wrong, there will be federal agents on this road within 15 minutes. Direct them to the main house." She got out, closed the door quietly, started toward the amber light. The property resolved out of the darkness as she moved toward it. A long, low-slung house, modernist, the kind of architecture that tries to look austere and instead looks expensive, with a wide gravel apron in front and a detached outbuilding to the left that had the functional shape of a generator housing. 2 vehicles were on the apron. One she recognized as the car Grant used for personal travel. The other was a black SUV she didn't know. Damien's people, or the others. She didn't have time to determine which. She was 50 feet from the front of the house when the outbuilding door burst open. 2 men came out fast. Not running, moving with the rapid, controlled directness of trained people executing something. One of them had his hand inside his jacket. The other was talking into a phone. She stopped moving. Her heart was doing something complicated, and she focused on breathing, on keeping her hands visible, on the specific discipline of not looking like a threat because she wasn't one and looking like one would be the last mistake she made. The man with his hand in his jacket clocked her and stopped. "Who are you?" Not a question. A demand issued by someone who had moved past the stage of caring about social conventions. "Lillian Mercer." She said it with the same flat directness she'd used in courtrooms for 11 years. "I own Mercer Investment Group. My husband is in that house. I need to speak with him." The 2 men exchanged a look that contained an entire conversation. The one with the phone said something into it she couldn't hear. There was a pause. Then he looked at her with an expression she couldn't categorize. Not hostile, not welcoming, something more purely assessing. "Inside," he said. The interior of the house was clean and functional in the specific way of a place that has been designed for use rather than comfort. Concrete floors, minimal furniture, lighting that was practical rather than aesthetic. The main room had a central table covered in documents and 2 laptops running, and there were 2 more men she didn't recognize stationed near the far wall, and there was Grant. He was standing at the table with his back to the door, and he turned when she came in, and for a long, suspended moment, they simply looked at each other across 12 feet of concrete floor and the ruins of 6 years and the specific, irrevocable territory of what he'd tried to do to her. He looked worse than he had at the courthouse. The composure was still there, but thinner now, structural rather than instinctive. The kind of control you maintain not because it's natural, but because dropping it would accelerate your own collapse. There was a cut on his left hand she hadn't noticed before, fresh, already dried at the edges. He'd hit something, or something had hit him in the hours since the courtroom. "Lillian." Her name in his mouth sounded like a problem he was reassessing. "Tell me who's above you," she said. He made a short, almost involuntary sound. Not a laugh. The thing a laugh becomes when humor has been completely evacuated from it. You drove 80 miles at night to ask me that. I drove 80 miles at night because in approximately 12 minutes, this property is going to have federal agents on one road and people sent by whoever you work for on another road, and the window you have to produce something that might matter for what happens to you next is closing. She walked toward him. The men near the wall adjusted slightly, not blocking her, just repositioning. She ignored them. I read the financial structures, Grant. I have 14 months of data from the server pulls I made before you took my access. I know what was moving through Mercer's accounts, and I know the approximate shape of the architecture above it. I don't have the beneficial owner. I don't have the top of the structure. You do. His jaw worked. You were pulling server data while you were... He stopped. Something moved through his face that might have been, in a different context, the beginning of something like respect. He killed it. When? Before the fog got bad enough that I couldn't. She stopped 3 feet from him. Up close, he smelled like the cologne she'd memorized over 6 years, and her nervous system did something involuntary and infuriating in response to that before her prefrontal cortex reasserted itself. Who sent the man in the gray coat? Grant looked at her. Then he looked at the men near the wall with an expression that reconfigured what she understood about the room. The men near the wall weren't his security. They were here ahead of him. The black SUV on the apron wasn't Damien's. She turned this understanding over very quickly and kept her face still while she did it. These gentlemen, Grant said, with an almost conversational quality, arrived approximately 8 minutes before you did. They've been making an argument for why I should leave with them tonight. A pause. I've been making a counter-argument. One of the men near the wall said, Ms. Mercer, you should leave. His voice had an accent she couldn't immediately place. Northern European, possibly, flat and precise. He was perhaps 45, with the specific economic physicality of someone who approached violence as a professional discipline rather than an emotional state. She stays, Grant said. That surprised her. She showed nothing. The man near the wall said, That's not... She has data from Mercer's servers. Grant's voice had found a new register. Not the grief-stricken husband, not the cornered corporate operative, something more fundamental underneath both of those. Someone deciding. 14 months. She said it herself. Which means she has the transfer records. Which means she has account numbers that will unravel the Cayman structure inside of 48 hours when she hands it to the FBI, which she is clearly about to do. He looked at the man near the wall directly. Tell your principal that the data she's carrying is the actual problem tonight, not me. The room had acquired a new quality of tension, not the legal procedural tension of the courtroom, older than that, more physical, the kind that lives in the space between people when the outcomes being calculated include ones that can't be appealed. Lillian felt her heartbeat in her fingertips. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She didn't reach for it. The man near the wall spoke quietly to the other in what sounded like Danish or Dutch, she couldn't tell. Then he looked at her with an expression that was almost apologetic in its efficiency. The drive, he said. No, Grant said. Mr. Holloway. Think! Grant's voice came out sharp and cold, and it was, she realized, probably the most honest thing she'd heard him say since this whole day began. If she hands over that drive voluntarily to the FBI, it's evidence. Chain of custody, legal process, takes months to unravel. If something happens to her tonight and the drive disappears, the FBI already knows she had it. She told her attorney. She told the agents. It's already in the record that it exists. Destroying the drive and destroying her creates a murder investigation on top of a federal financial case, and you will have every resource this country has pointed directly at whatever's left of the structure. He was breathing harder now. Your principal is not an idiot. Run the calculation. A silence. Then, from outside, the sound of gravel under tires. Multiple vehicles, and underneath that, carried on the cold air through the thin walls of the house, the percussive, distant sound of a helicopter. Everyone in the room heard it. The man near the wall made a decision. She could see it happen. The specific compression of a person accelerating their timeline. He moved toward the table. Grant moved at the same moment. What happened in the next 4 seconds was fast and ugly and did not have the choreographed quality of the action sequences Lillian had seen in theaters, which were nothing like this. No clarity, no camera angle that made sense of the geometry, just bodies in a small space making rapid, violent decisions about distance and momentum. Grant hit the table. Documents went. One laptop slid to the floor. The man from the wall had something in his hand that wasn't a gun, but was held like one, and Grant had his wrist, and they were in the specific grinding, straining contest of two people of similar size and different motivations finding out which motivation was stronger. The second man from the wall moved toward Lillian. She stepped back. Her heel caught the edge of the concrete step at the entry, and she went down hard on one knee, the impact sending a white bolt of pain up her leg that she processed and filed and ignored because the man was still moving and she was on the floor, and there was a 3-second window between where he was and where she was, and she used it. She grabbed the laptop that had slid to the floor. She threw it at his face. Not accurately. It caught his shoulder and he flinched, and that flinch was enough. She got up, got the table between them, and he pulled up and looked at her across it with an expression that had lost its apologetic quality entirely. Outside, the sound of vehicles stopping, voices. The helicopter was closer. The front door burst open. Damien Vescari came through it first, which she hadn't expected, and she'd somehow assumed he would be the kind of man who sent people into rooms and waited outside them. But apparently that assumption didn't hold in all circumstances because he came through the door with 2 of his men behind him and took in the geometry of the room in approximately 1 second, and said something short and specific. She didn't catch, and the 2 men moved. What followed was loud and brief and unpleasant in the compressed, percussive manner of violence happening in an enclosed space with hard floors. The man who had been approaching Lillian got as far as reaching the edge of the table before one of Damien's men put him on the ground with the specific, efficient economy of someone for whom this was maintenance rather than escalation. The other man, the one wrestling with Grant, released him as the second of Damien's men arrived at his position, and Grant staggered back against the wall, breathing hard, his jacket torn at the shoulder and the cut on his hand reopened and leaking down his fingers. Damien stood in the center of the room. He looked at Lillian. "Are you hurt?" "No. Her knee was going to be spectacular tomorrow. There are more of them outside." "We know." He was already looking at the 2 men his people had taken to the floor. "There are 4 vehicles on the East Access Road. Federal agents are on the main road approximately 8 minutes out." He looked at her again with a directness that had a quality she hadn't seen from him before. Not the detached, instrumental quality of the courthouse, but something more immediate. "You should not be in this room. I'm the only person in this room he'll talk to." Damien looked at Grant. Something passed between them that had nothing to do with her. The specific mutual assessment of 2 people who have understood each other at a distance for a long time and are now in the same physical space for the first time. "Vescari," Grant said. His voice was rough. He pressed the back of his wrist against the cut on his hand. "I should have—" He stopped. "It doesn't matter." "No," Damien said. "It doesn't. Who's on the East Road?" Grant looked at the 2 men on the floor, not as people, not exactly, more like people who had been above him in a structure he'd understood himself to be operating. "Volkov's people? Or the other side of it?" Damien said nothing. Grant laughed again. That evacuated of humor sound. "It's Volkov, the structure I've been—" He stopped, looked at Lillian, "Dat." The expression on his face was the strangest thing she'd seen from him yet. Not the grief performance, not the cold calculation, not the fear from the courthouse. Something almost like the face of the man she'd thought she'd married, appearing like a watermark under everything else. "I didn't—" He stopped again. "Don't," she said. Her voice was very level. "Don't do that now." The extraction was his. 230 million. Mercer's accounts were the vehicle. I built the structure. I did that. But He pressed his wrist harder against his hand. The end point was always his. I was supposed to hand him operational control of Mercer Investment Group, and he would use it to— He shook his head. "I thought I was the one who understood the whole board. I didn't understand the whole board." "Who is Volkov?" Lillian said. Grant looked at her. Outside, the sound of the approaching vehicles had gotten louder and then stopped, which meant they were on the property now, which meant something was happening on the east road that wasn't visible from inside the house. And the helicopter was directly overhead now, its rotor wash pressing down on the roof like a physical weight. Viktor Volkov runs 4 sovereign investment vehicles out of Geneva, Grant said. Nominally. They're clean on paper. The actual flow it's sanctions evasion. He needed American institutional infrastructure to move restricted capital. Your company was the right size, the right reputation, the right... He looked at her. You. Me. Your name. Mercer is your name, your father's name. It carries weight that couldn't be bought any other way. That's what he wanted. That's what I was supposed to deliver. The doors of the house, front and the side entry she hadn't come through, opened simultaneously. Federal agents came through the front. 3 of them, with the specific controlled movement of people executing a prepared approach, weapons drawn, and then immediately adjusted when they clocked the configuration of bodies in the room. Agent Reyes came through the side entry. She had her badge in her hand and her eyes moved around the room with the rapid, comprehensive scan of someone adding and subtracting variables in real time. Her eyes settled on Lillian. "You're alive," Reyes said. Flat, professional. Something underneath it that wasn't quite relief, but was adjacent. "Yes." Reyes looked at Grant, at the 2 men on the floor, at Damien's people who had not moved, at Damien himself who had not moved, and who returned her gaze with the specific, composed equanimity of a man who has calculated this moment in advance and found his position in it acceptable. "Mr. Holloway," Reyes said, "Viktor Volkov's representatives are currently being detained on the East Access Road, 3 of them. They're traveling under diplomatic cover, which means this is going to be complicated, but the cover won't hold past tonight given what we already have." She held his eyes. "You have approximately 45 minutes before his attorneys arrive and close every window you have to be the person who cooperated. After that, you're just another element of the structure." The helicopter overhead had begun to descend. Its rotor noise was massive, filling the house with a physical pressure, and the exterior lights of the property blazed on all at once under its searchlights, turning the amber night into something flat and absolute and inescapable. Grant looked at Lillian. The last time he'd looked at her in the courtroom, it had been the recalculating look, the chess player checking the board. This was different. This had the particular exhausted quality of someone who has run a very long route and found that the place they've arrived is not the place they were trying to get to, and all the energy that went into the running is simply gone now, just the destination left, which is nothing like they planned. "The offshore account structures are documented in a server in Zurich," he said. "Account number and access code." "Stop." Reyes held up her hand. "Not here. Not like this. Your attorney, I fired Baines 3 hours ago." Grant looked at her. "I'll need a different attorney." "Yes. And I'll need to know what happens to..." He stopped. Looked at Lillian one more time, and she understood that whatever he was about to ask for in terms of what happened to him, the specific legal architecture of his situation, the potential outcomes, he had looked at her first to see if she was still the person he'd spent 6 years modeling, still the person he'd believed he could predict. She looked back at him without expression. He looked away. "I'll give you Volkov," he said to Reyes. "The full structure, all 4 vehicles, the beneficial ownership chains, the sanction evasion instruments, the contact network." A pause. "The man who recruited me 9 years ago, I'll give you all of it." 9 years, 3 years before they'd met. She'd been right about the timeline, and she wished she hadn't been. Reyes looked at her partner. An exchange of information neither of them spoke aloud. Then Reyes said, "Read him his rights." While Toll did that, in the flat, declarative cadences of a formula repeated so many times it had lost its individual words, Lillian walked to the window and looked out at the property bathed in helicopter light. The gravel apron, the vehicles, the tree line where the darkness began, the agents moving on the east road toward the other vehicles. Damien came to stand beside her, not close, the appropriate distance of someone who had been useful and knew what useful meant and what it didn't. "Volkov," she said. "Yes." "You've been trying to get to Volkov for how long?" A pause. "Long enough. She turned to look at him. In the helicopter light coming through the window, he looked like exactly what he was. A man who moved through the world in the spaces between legal structures, who had his own reasons for everything he'd done tonight, reasons that intersected with hers at this particular coordinate and would diverge after it. The footage, she said. The toxicology. The 9 months of surveillance. You were building a case against Grant because Grant would lead you to Volkov. Yes. And I was the mechanism that let you get close enough to build it. He held her eyes. You were also a woman being poisoned by her husband. A pause. Both things can be true. She turned back to the window. Outside, Grant was being walked toward a federal vehicle by 2 agents, his hands behind him, his expensive suit catching the flat, brutal light of the helicopter as though the quality of the fabric was surprised to find itself here. She watched him until he was in the vehicle and the door was closed. 8 months of poison, 6 years of architecture, 22 months of documented planning, and 3 years before that of patient, invisible setup. A marriage that had been a mechanism from its first day. She was still standing. She was going to be furious about this for the rest of her life, and that was appropriate. And right now she was still standing, and for tonight that was enough. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. Patricia. She answered. "Tell me you're alive," Patricia said. "I'm alive." "Tell me you did something irreversible tonight." "Several things." She pressed her forehead briefly against the cool glass of the window. "Get Reyes on your phone. I'm going to send you photographs of every document on the table in this room before the agents inventory them. And call whatever financial forensics firm we used on the Kellner case 3 years ago. We're going to need them tomorrow morning." "Lillian, I'm fine, Patricia. I'll explain everything at—" The window she was leaning against cracked. Not broke. Cracked. A single, fine spiderweb fracture spreading from a central point at the level of her shoulder. And it took her brain approximately 1 full second to process what a crack in a window at that location and in that pattern meant. And in that second, Damien had already moved. He was across the room in a motion she didn't fully track. She was moving too because her body had processed the information before her conscious mind finished the sentence. And something hit the wall behind where she'd been standing with a sound that was wrong in the specific way of things traveling faster than sound should. She hit the floor before she understood she was falling. Not gracefully, not the way people fall in movies, controlled and telegraphed. She went down hard on her left side, concrete meeting her elbow and hip with the specific, unambiguous brutality of a surface that has no interest in softening anything. And the air went out of her lungs in a single compressed burst, and for approximately 2 seconds she was just a body on a floor with no cognitive access to the situation. Then the situation came back. Damien was flat against the interior wall to the left of the window, one hand pressed to his right shoulder, and the quality of how he was pressing it, the specific white-knuckled controlled pressure of someone managing something rather than reacting to something, told her what she needed to know before she saw the dark spreading through his jacket fabric. "Stay down," he said. His voice was level, infuriatingly level, the voice of a man who had filed being shot under an expected category. Reyes was already on her radio, flat against the opposite wall, her voice clipped and rapid. 2 of her agents had their weapons drawn and were moving toward the side entry in the controlled, low crouch of people who had trained for exactly this. The 3rd agent had Grant on the ground behind the federal vehicle outside. She could see through the cracked window, the glass fracture turning the exterior light into a fractured starburst. Grant face down on the gravel with his hands behind his head, which meant the agent had processed the shot and responded correctly. One of Damien's men said something in a language she didn't speak and moved toward the back of the house. Lillian got up on one knee. Her elbow was bleeding. She'd torn the skin against the concrete, a wide, shallow abrasion that burned cleanly without depth. She looked at the cracked window. The shot had come from outside. The angle of the fracture, the location of the impact point on the wall behind where she'd been standing. She ran the geometry quickly and came up with the tree line to the north, the edge of the property where the helicopter's searchlight didn't quite reach, a band of shadow approximately 40 feet wide between the lit apron and the full dark of the trees. The East Road. Volkov's people had been detained on the East Road, but the property had 3 access roads. "There's a 3rd approach from the north," she said, loud enough for Reyes to hear. Reyes looked at her sharply. Into her radio. We need coverage on the northern perimeter. Possible shooter in the tree line, north side of the main structure. A pause, receiving. Copy. She looked at Lillian. Get away from the window. I'm already away from the window. Get further. Lillian moved to the far wall and sat with her back against it, her knees pulled up, her elbow dripping onto the concrete in a small, steady pattern. She looked at Damien, who had not moved from his position against the wall to the left of the window. He had his phone in his left hand, his right hand was still pressed to his shoulder, and he was reading something on the screen with the focused attention of a man who refuses to allow pain to be the most important thing in the room. How bad? She said. Manageable. He looked up. You're bleeding. Concrete, not a bullet. He looked back at his phone. There were supposed to be only 3 vehicles on the East Road. A pause. There were 4. The 4th wasn't there when we arrived. It came in after. He said something to his remaining man. The man moved. Outside, she heard the helicopter reposition, the rotor sound changing pitch as it swept north, the searchlight swinging, and then from that direction, 2 sounds in rapid sequence that she identified correctly and didn't let herself process emotionally. Then voices on the radio and Reyes exhaling slowly through her nose. Shooter is down, Reyes said. Flat, professional. He's alive. Barely. The room was very quiet for a moment. The helicopter held its new position. The searchlight blazed across the north face of the property, turning the tree line into a stark black and white photograph of bare branches and late November underbrush. Lillian looked at the blood dripping from her elbow onto the concrete floor and thought about the 7 months she'd spent believing she was losing her mind, and the specific texture of that, the way you begin to doubt the thing doing the doubting, the way certainty becomes a resource that depletes. And she thought about sitting in courtrooms while people she'd trusted testified against her with the smooth, assured language of people who had been paid to be certain. And she thought about Grant's face when the footage played, the 3 seconds of emptiness before the grief came back. She thought about all of it, and she didn't cry, because she was going to get through the next several hours first, and then she was going to cry somewhere private where no one needed anything from her. For now, there was still work. Bamitisham. The medics arrived 12 minutes later, summoned by the federal response team. They went to Damien first because his injury was interior rather than surface, and he submitted to their attention with the specific, slightly impatient compliance of a man who understood the necessity without welcoming the vulnerability. The bullet had entered the lateral deltoid, through and through, which the medic said was fortunate, which Damien received with an expression of minimal gratitude. They cleaned Lillian's elbow and wrapped it, and she answered their questions and then went to find Reyes. Reyes was outside, on the gravel apron, coordinating 4 different threads of response simultaneously through 2 phones and a radio. She saw Lillian approaching and held up one finger. Wait. And finished a conversation and lowered the phone. The 4th vehicle, Lillian said, one of Volkov's secondary assets. A local contractor, American, hired through 2 layers of cutout. He had a position in the tree line before we arrived. He was waiting. Reyes paused. He was waiting specifically for this scenario, a fallback instruction in case the primary team was interdicted. He was supposed to ensure Grant didn't cooperate. Grant, yes, and potentially you. Reyes held her eyes. The data you're carrying eliminates a significant portion of the cover structure. You became a target when you walked into this property tonight. Lillian absorbed that. Grant saved my life in that room. When he told them the drive was already in the record, that destroying it would create more problems. He was protecting himself, but the effect... Yes. Reyes said it without additional commentary. The moral complexity of the thing was not, apparently, something she needed to narrate. Where is he now? Federal custody. He's already called an attorney, not Baines, someone from Washington. He wants to cooperate. He's been very clear about that. Reyes looked at the vehicle Grant had been loaded into, still on the apron. What he's offering on Volkov is significant. We've been trying to build a case on Viktor Volkov's American operation for 3 years. Your husband was the keystone of that operation. Without him, we had circumstantial threading. With him, she stopped. It changes things substantially. Lillian looked at the helicopter, still holding its northern position, searchlight burning down into the tree line like an accusation. What happens to Grant? That's a conversation between him, his attorney, and the Department of Justice. I can't tell you what the outcome is going to be. I know you can't tell me. She looked back at Reyes. I'm asking what you think. Reyes was quiet for a moment, a long, assessing quiet. He built a sophisticated fraud that caused substantial harm to a number of people and nearly destroyed you. He'll serve time. The cooperation will matter for the length and conditions. But he'll serve time. A pause. Is that enough for you? Lillian considered the question with the serious attention it deserved. No, she said. But I've learned in the last 8 months not to require my feelings about something to match what's available. Reyes looked at her for a moment with an expression that might have been the closest she came to human warmth on a working night. I'm going to need a full statement from you tomorrow. Comprehensive. Everything you documented, everything you know about the Mercer account structures, everything Raymond Holt told you tonight. She paused. And I'm going to need the hard drive. Lillian reached into her coat pocket, produced it, held it out. Reyes took it. You made copies. I made copies. She said it without apology. Encrypted, stored in 3 locations. My attorney has the access credentials. She held Reyes's eyes. For the case, not for anything else. Reyes pocketed the drive. Good night, Ms. Mercer. Marcus had moved the car to the property entrance when the federal vehicles came through. When she walked back down the gravel drive, she found him exactly there, parked just off the road with the engine running and the heat on inside. She got in, sat down. The seat was warm. She pressed her wrapped elbow against her side and looked out the windshield at the tree line and the night and the distant wash of helicopter light. Marcus said nothing for approximately 90 seconds. Then, do you want to go home? She thought about the house, the bedroom she'd slept in for 6 years with the beige ceiling and the residual smell of Grant's cologne. The kitchen where he'd prepared her morning medication with such devoted, attentive care. The bathroom cabinet where 17 documented instances had happened inside what she'd understood to be the private architecture of her own life. No, she said. Take me to the office. Ms. Mercer, not to work. I just don't want to go to the house tonight. She looked at him in the mirror. There's a couch in the executive lounge on 21. I've slept on it before, during the Hendricks merger. He held her eyes in the mirror for a moment. Then he put the car in gear. She slept 4 hours on the lounge couch with her coat pulled over her and woke before dawn to the specific quality of silence that large empty buildings have in the hours before the people who use them arrive. The city outside the windows was still mostly dark, a handful of lights across the skyline burning with the particular resolution of things that never fully turn off. She lay there for a moment and let the events of the last 24 hours settle against her in their full weight. She did this deliberately, the way you press a bruise to understand its true extent. The courtroom in the morning, which felt approximately 6 years ago. Langford's testimony. The conference room with Reyes. Raymond in her office with his devastated, guilty face. The drive north. The house. The window cracking. Concrete against her elbow. Damien's hand pressed to his shoulder with that infuriating composure. Grant's face when he told them about the drive. The specific expression of a man doing one decent thing inside a structure built of indecent ones, and what that was worth or wasn't worth, and the fact that she was going to have to decide over time rather than right now. She got up, found the small bathroom adjacent to the lounge, and washed her face and looked at herself in the mirror. The reflection was still the sharp-edged, hollow-eyed version from the courthouse. But something was different in it. She looked at it for a while and located the difference. It wasn't in the features. It was in the eyes themselves, the quality of what was happening behind them. For 8 months, behind her eyes, there had been a woman who was losing the argument about her own reality, constantly revising, constantly uncertain, constantly fielding the question of whether the ground she stood on was solid or whether it was her perception of it that was failing. That woman was gone. What had replaced her was not comfortable or particularly at peace, but it was certain in the specific way of someone who has had their reality dismantled and reconstructed from primary evidence and now knows exactly what it's built on. She went back to her office. Made coffee in the small machine on the credenza that was supposed to be for client meetings. Opened her laptop. Started working. What? Patricia arrived at 7:45 with 2 bags from a bakery on Michigan Avenue and the expression of a woman who had also not slept adequately but had decided that was a condition to be managed rather than acknowledged. "Your elbow," she said, looking at the bandage. "Concrete. I'm fine. Sit down." Patricia sat, opened one of the bags, put a container of coffee in front of Lillian. "Reyes called me at 6. She wants the full statement this afternoon. I told her 2 o'clock. Fine. She also told me that Raymond Holt presented himself at the FBI field office at 11:45 last night and requested to make a full statement. Apparently whatever you said to him in this office was persuasive. I told him the truth about his timeline." Lillian drank the coffee. It was better than the machine coffee. She filed that information. "What do we know about the board members?" 4 of them, as you suspected. Sandra Chu, Marcus Webb, Daniel Rice, and Aaron Tolar. All 4 have received federal target letters as of this morning. Chu resigned her board position at 7:10, which is... Patricia checked her watch. 22 minutes ago. The others haven't moved yet. Sandra Chu in the gallery doorway, looking back. The specific complicated expression. Lillian put a name on it now. The expression of someone watching a plan that they're involved in, beginning to produce consequences they'd been assured would not reach them. "Call an emergency board session for tomorrow, whatever remains of the board." Lillian looked at her laptop. "I need to reestablish operational authority formally, and I need to do it before the news cycle on this fully crystallizes. The clients need to hear from me directly, not from journalists reconstructing yesterday." "There's also the question of your personal situation," Patricia said carefully. "The house. I'll sort the house. Not today." She looked at her attorney. "Is the guardianship order fully vacated?" "Judge Carver filed the formal vacatur this morning at 6:48. Every document, every restriction, every piece of that proceeding has been struck from the record." Patricia paused. She also, apparently, filed a formal judicial complaint against Dr. Langford with the medical board, which is somewhat outside her usual practice and suggests she's not happy. Lillian thought about Judge Carver's face in the courtroom. 19 years on the bench. The very specific way she'd said what she had heard was among the most systematic abuses of the guardianship system she'd encountered. "No," she said. "I don't imagine she is." Yes. At 10 in the morning, Damian Vescari's attorney, Carter, who appeared to function on no sleep and something approximating professional satisfaction, called and informed Lillian that Damian was in a hospital in the city having his shoulder attended to properly and was expected to be discharged that afternoon. Lillian asked for the hospital name. Carter gave it. She went at noon. The room was private, which was obviously how it was going to be. He was sitting up in the bed when she arrived, his jacket gone, his right shoulder bandaged, and he was reading something on a tablet with the focused attention of a man who had not particularly adjusted his daily schedule to accommodate a bullet wound. He looked up when she came in. "Put the tablet down." She sat in the chair beside the bed. There was a small silence that wasn't uncomfortable. The silence of 2 people who have been through something together and are determining what that means now that the acute phase is over. "How's the shoulder?" she said. "They want me here until tomorrow. I'm leaving at 4. "Of course you are." She looked at him. The hospital light was flat and somewhat uncharitable, the same category as courthouse fluorescence, and he looked in it exactly like what he was, a man in his mid-50s who had taken a bullet the night before and whose primary response to that was inconvenience. "I need to ask you something." "Ask." "Last night, the way this was constructed, Grant leading to Volkov, you used Mercer's situation, my situation, as the operational approach to a target you'd been working toward for how long?" He was quiet for a moment. Not evasive, she'd learned enough about his particular way of being in conversation to distinguish between the two, considering. 11 months, he said, from when I became aware of what was being done to you to last night. And before that? Before you were aware of what was being done to me. Volkov has intersected with my interests for a longer time than 11 months. He held her eyes. What you're asking is whether what happened to you was useful to me. Yes. The answer is yes. No qualification, no softening, just the flat acknowledgement of a man who had decided that the truth, delivered plainly, was more respectful than a careful construction of it. Your situation provided access to a structure I couldn't reach through other methods. I would not have manufactured your situation. I didn't manufacture it. But when it existed, I used it. She sat with that for a moment. It was not a comfortable thing to sit with. It was also, she recognized, the most honest thing anyone had said to her in probably 2 years. And she had learned recently to calibrate the value of honesty against its comfort rather than conflating them. "Thank you," she said, "for telling me that directly." He looked faintly surprised. "Not much. Just a small adjustment around the eyes." "What will you do now?" "Rebuild." She looked at the window. The city was visible, a gray December sky, the architectural geometry of the skyline doing what it always did, which was stand there being enormous and indifferent. Fire the 4 board members, restructure the compliance architecture, hire outside counsel to conduct a full audit of the account flows, and notify every client individually. She paused. Establish a foundation for guardianship abuse victims. There are people who went through what I went through and didn't have a Damien Vescari walk through the courtroom door. "No," he said. "Most don't." She looked back at him. "The foundation is going to need legal counsel who understands how these schemes are structured. I'm going to need someone who can advise on the financial architecture of manufactured incompetence cases." A pause. "I'm not asking you to do that." "I know you're not. I'm saying the work will exist, in case it's relevant to your interests." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. The small, controlled acknowledgement of a man who had understood a subtext and was choosing to receive it exactly as offered, no more. "I'll keep that in mind." She stood, picked up her coat from the back of the chair. "Volkov? He'll be indicted. The cooperation agreement Grant is negotiating will produce enough for an indictment, whether he's extradited." A pause. "That will take time. But it's moving. It's moving." She put her coat on. Looked at him once more in the flat hospital light. The specific strange man who had walked through a courtroom door and stopped a proceeding that was designed to end her, who had his own reasons for everything he'd done and had told her so plainly, who had taken a bullet in a farmhouse north of the city with the composure of someone for whom being shot was an administrative inconvenience. "Get out of the hospital before 4 if you want," she said. "They can't actually stop you." "I know," he said. "I'm staying until 4 to make Carter feel better." She almost laughed. The almost laugh was the closest thing she'd produced to actual laughter in 8 months, and it felt, physically, like something releasing that had been compressed for a very long time. "Feel better, Mr. Vescari?" "Miss Mercer." He picked up the tablet. "Don't walk in front of any more windows tonight." She left. The board session happened the following morning. Whatever remained of it, 5 members, 2 of whom looked like they'd survived a natural disaster, and 3 of whom looked like they were still in the middle of one, convened in the main conference room on the 20th floor under the specific gravity of a situation that had no precedent in Mercer Investment Group's history. Lillian ran the session. She was brief. She presented the facts as they had been established and the actions she was taking and the timeline for client notification and the forensic audit and the restructuring of governance. She did not perform emotion, and she did not perform the opposite of emotion. She was simply precise and clear and present in the specific way that used to come naturally and that she was relearning in increments. When she finished, she looked around the table. "Does anyone have questions about what I've just outlined?" Nobody did. "Then we're adjourned." The client letters went out over the following week. She wrote each one herself. Not with assistance, not with counsel's template, herself individually, because these were people who had put their names and their assets and their future security behind her name on a door. And she owed them the specific weight of her own words rather than an institutional formulation. Most responded. The responses were what you'd expect from a spectrum of human reaction. Some cold, some shaken, some asking procedurally focused questions, 2 expressing something that edged towards something she could only read as personal concern for her. One client, a woman in her 70s who had been with Mercer since Lillian's father ran the firm, called her directly. Your father would have found this situation extremely upsetting, the woman said. Yes, Lillian said. He would have. He also would have been proud of how you're handling it. She didn't answer immediately. The locked room behind her sternum, the one she'd been maintaining for approximately 7 days now, with some success, made itself known. She breathed in. Out. Thank you, Eleanor. Don't thank me. Just don't let the lawyers write the next letter. I could tell you wrote this one. She smiled at her desk. I will. Best. The forensic audit took 11 weeks. At the end of it, the full scope of the extraction had been documented at $267 million, $37 million more than her initial estimate, routed through structures she hadn't identified in her late-night work on the laptop. The Department of Justice filed a 43-count indictment against Viktor Volkov in absentia. 3 of his financial proxies in the United States were arrested within the week. Extradition proceedings began, which Reyes told her, in a phone call characterized by the same brisk, direct quality of every communication they'd had, would take years and might not succeed. But the American operation is dismantled, Reyes said. Everything that was running through your company, through the account structures, it's gone. He'll build something else eventually. These people always do, but not through Mercer. That's enough, Lillian said. She meant it. Grant pleaded guilty to 4 counts of financial fraud, conspiracy, and, the one that had taken the longest to negotiate, 1 count related to the deliberate administration of a controlled substance without consent, which was the law's careful, inadequate language for what she'd been experiencing for 8 months in her own home. The sentencing was 12 years. With the cooperation credit, his attorney was arguing for 8 effective with conditions. The DOJ had agreed to 8, which Reyes had communicated to her neutrally and which she had received neutrally. She didn't go to the sentencing. Patricia offered to go on her behalf. Lillian told her it wasn't necessary. She spent that morning instead in a meeting with an architect, working through the design for a small foundation office space on the 14th floor of the Mercer building. Below the executive floors, close enough to the street to be accessible, built to house a team that would specialize in identifying and supporting victims of manufactured incompetence and financial guardianship abuse. She had already had 17 contacts in the first week after the news broke. People who had found her through the coverage. People who had been through versions of her situation with fewer resources and less fortune and who walked through their courtroom door. She looked at the floor plans, made 3 changes, approved the concept. Damien Viscari was not in the courtroom for Grant's sentencing. She hadn't expected him to be. He operated in the spaces between proceedings, not inside them. She'd had 2 phone calls with him in the 11 weeks since the farmhouse, both brief, both substantive, neither personal in any way that exceeded what was functionally necessary. She did not know how to categorize what they were to each other, and she had decided not to require a category for it. 3 weeks after the sentencing, she was working late in her office. Late being relative now, 8 o'clock rather than the 11 o'clock it would have been in the years before Grant, before the fog, before the gradual narrowing of her world, when her desk phone rang. The desk phone almost never rang anymore. She picked it up. Mercer. There's someone in the lobby who says he has an appointment. Marcus, from the security desk downstairs. He'd taken on a building coordination role during the restructuring, which had happened partly by his own quiet initiative and which she'd formalized without ceremony. He doesn't have an appointment, but he says you'll want to come down. She knew before she asked. What's his name? A pause. He didn't give one. He said you'd know from the description. Marcus paused again. Silver at the temples. He looks like someone's inconvenient problem. She set the phone down, picked up her coat, took the elevator to the lobby. Damien was standing near the security desk, hands in the pockets of a dark coat, looking at the lobby architecture with the idle attention of someone who has learned to use waiting time productively. He looked completely recovered. Shoulder healed or healing underneath the coat. The composed, self-contained quality fully reinstated. She stopped in front of him. You could have called. I was in the building. He looked at her. Carter has been in conversation with your legal team about the Volkov extradition. I thought it was time to come in person. You could have used Carter for that too. Yes. He held her eyes. I could have. The lobby was quiet at this hour. The security desk, Marcus pretending not to listen, the particular ambient hum of a building at rest. Outside the glass, the city was doing its perpetual thing, lit and moving and indifferent and alive. She looked at Damien Viscari in the lobby of the building that bore her name and thought about the calculus of what she owed him and what he'd taken from her, and the specific complexity of the fact that both of those things were true simultaneously and were going to remain true, and that she was old enough and battered enough now to hold a complexity without requiring it to resolve. The Foundation is hiring an advisory board, she said. I need someone who understands how financial predation is structured at the level where it intersects with legal systems, how these operations are built, how they choose targets. She held his eyes. I'm not asking you to be on a board. I'm asking if you know people who understand this structure from the inside and might be willing to translate it into a language that helps people recognize when it's being done to them. He considered this with the seriousness it deserved. I know people. I thought you might. Another pause. Something in the lobby light shifted. Cloud movement outside, maybe, or simply the hour changing the quality of the city beyond the glass. How are you? He said. Just that. No frame around it, just the question. She took a breath. The answer was not simple, and she didn't make it simple. Better than 8 months ago, different than before that. She looked at her hands, then back at him. I spent 6 years of my life inside a plan I didn't know existed. I'm still sorting out which parts of that time were real and which were constructed for me. A pause. Some of it was real. That's the part that's hardest. He nodded. Once. The nod of someone who has been told something true and is receiving it as such. The anger, she continued, is going to be there for a long time. I've accepted that. I'm building something with it instead of just carrying it. She looked at him steadily. I'm going to be all right. It wasn't performance. It wasn't the brave declaration you make in movies right before the swell of music tells you how to feel. It was something quieter and more durable than that. The specific, flat-footed acknowledgement of a woman who had been systematically dismantled and had rebuilt herself from the raw material of what she actually was, without the benefit of illusions about what that process felt like. Damien looked at her for a long moment. Yes, he said. I believe you will be. He turned toward the door, paused with one hand on the glass. The Volkov extradition, he said, without turning around. It will take time, but it will complete. How do you know? A pause. Because I'm going to ensure it does. He pushed the door open. The cold December air came through for a moment, carrying the smell of the city, exhaust and river, and the particular metallic edge of a night that was going to snow. Good night, Ms. Mercer. The door closed behind him. She stood in the lobby and watched him cross the plaza outside. The particular way he moved through the lit and populated spaces of the world, precisely occupying his own gravity, disappearing into the stream of the city without effort. Marcus said quietly, He doesn't have an appointment next time either. I know. She turned back toward the elevator. That's fine. She went upstairs, sat at her desk. The city spread out beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. Billions of dollars moving invisibly through the dark in every direction, through structures clean and obscured, through names trusted and names fabricated, through the specific ancient human machinery of people trying to accumulate what they believed would make them safe. She opened her laptop, found the draft of the Foundation's mission statement, which she'd been writing and revising for 3 weeks and had not yet finished. She read what was there, found the sentence she'd been circling around for 3 weeks, the sentence that was supposed to say what the Foundation existed to do, in language precise enough to be useful and human enough to be real. She deleted the draft sentence, typed a new one. We exist because the most sophisticated crime is the one that uses a person's trust against them, and because the people best equipped to recognize it are the ones who survived it. She read it twice. Left it. Outside, the first snow of December began to fall across the city. Light and early, coating the plaza where Damien had walked, covering the cold geometry of the streets, Settling on the glass of 37 floors of a building that bore a name she had spent 11 years earning and 8 months defending and would spend the rest of her working life making mean something worth the cost of keeping it. She turned back to the screen. She had work to do, and she was, for the first time in a very long time, exactly the person capable of doing it.